London, 1847. The magnificent Hartington ballroom glittered under the light of 1,000 candles, crystal chandeliers casting prismatic rainbows across marble floors, as Lady Emiline Blackwood stepped through the grand entrance for her long-anticipated debut into society. At 20 years of age, with chestnut curls framing delicate features and eyes the color of amber, she was indeed a vision in white silk and seed pearls, though her slender frame and ink-stained fingertips betrayed her preference for books over needlework. The daughter of the late Viscount Blackwood, Emiline had spent 3 years in mourning after her father had taken his own life. A scandal whispered about in every drawing-room in England, but tonight was meant to signal her re-emergence into proper society, her chance to establish herself beyond the shadow of family disgrace. She had practiced her curtsy for weeks, memorized appropriate topics of conversation, and steeled herself against the inevitable whispers that would follow her, but nothing had prepared her for the calculated cruelty of Lady Beatrice Winfield. As Emmeline accepted a dance with the young Earl of Pembroke, she caught sight of her childhood rival approaching with deliberate purpose, golden curls bouncing beneath a diamond tiara, blue eyes alight with malicious intent. Lady Beatrice, whose father had acquired Blackwood Manor after the Viscount's death, had tormented Emmeline since childhood, and clearly intended to continue the tradition. The collision appeared accidental to most observers, a simple misstep as the ladies' paths crossed, but Emmeline felt the precise pressure of Beatrice's elbow against her arm, saw the calculated tilt of the crystal wine glass before its contents spilled across her pristine white gown. The crimson liquid spread like a blood stain across the delicate silk, ruining in an instant both the gown and any hope of a successful debut. Gasps echoed through the ballroom as conversation halted, and all eyes turned to witness her humiliation. "Did you truly think someone would want you with that scandalous family history?" Lady Beatrice murmured, her voice pitched low enough that only Emmeline could hear the venom beneath the false concern. "How dreadful! What a tragedy! Perhaps you should retire for the evening." Emmeline stood frozen, her carefully constructed composure threatening to shatter as titters and whispers spread through the crowd like ripples in a pond. Her aunt, Lady Harriet, rushed forward with a handkerchief, but the damage was irreparable. With remarkable dignity, Emmeline declined offers of assistance, forcing her lips into a smile that never reached her eyes. "I shall retire to freshen up," she announced to her concerned aunt, though inside her heart pounded with the desperate need to escape, to find solitude away from pitying glances and cruel whispers. As she slipped away from the ballroom, ostensibly heading toward the ladies' withdrawing room, Emmeline made a split-second decision, turning instead toward a servant's staircase she had noticed earlier. Gathering her ruined skirts, she began to climb, seeking the one place where society could not follow, where she might finally allow her tears to fall in private, unaware that her sanctuary was already occupied by another soul seeking escape from the suffocating constraints of the ton. The narrow servant's staircase wound upward in tight spirals, each step taking Emmeline farther from the glittering cruelty of the ballroom below. Her silk slippers whispered against worn stone as she climbed, one hand clutching her ruined gown to prevent tripping, the other trailing along the rough wall for balance. The stairwell grew darker as she ascended, but Emmeline pressed onward, drawn by a sliver of moonlight visible through a small window above. When she finally reached the uppermost landing, she discovered a simple wooden door, unlatched and beckoning. Pushing it open, Emmeline stepped out into the cool embrace of the night air, her first deep breath since the wine had spilled across her gown. The rooftop garden stretched before her like an unexpected haven, a forgotten paradise atop the chaos of London society. Stone benches nestled among climbing roses whose perfume scented the night air, while potted topiaries created secluded alcoves perfect for solitary contemplation. Moonlight bathed the space in silver, transforming even the simplest ivy tendril into something magical and otherworldly. Emiline moved to the stone balustrade, gazing out over Mayfair. The distant sounds of violins and laughter rising from below like echoes from another world. She could feel the tears she had suppressed finally threatening to spill, her throat aching with the effort of maintaining composure. With trembling fingers, she tugged at her ruined gloves, peeling away the stained silk to reveal hands that told her true story. Ink stains marked her fingertips, permanent evidence of her secret passion that no amount of lemon juice or scrubbing could fully erase. She should have known London would be just as cruel as home, she whispered to herself, examining the dark smudges that branded her as different, thoughtful, a woman who dared to have ideas beyond securing a suitable husband. These marked hands had filled countless journals with stories, observations, and poetry, creating worlds where women were valued for their minds rather than their dowries or connections. The cool night breeze dried the first tear that escaped down her cheek, carrying away the cloying scents of perfume and punch that had filled the ballroom. Up here, Emiline could breathe again, could feel herself returning to her true nature after hours of performing the role society demanded. She moved to a stone bench partially hidden by climbing roses, sinking down onto the cool surface and finally allowing her rigid posture to soften. The wine stain would never come out of the expensive gown her aunt had commissioned, but in this moment, Emiline found she cared little for the ruined silk. All her life she had been judged for circumstances beyond her control, her father's actions casting a shadow that seemed inescapable. Perhaps London society would never truly accept her, but here under the vast expanse of stars, that rejection seemed suddenly less important than remaining true to herself. She closed her eyes, savoring the solitude, unaware that her carefully chosen sanctuary was about to be shared with the one man in London who might understand her need for escape. A soft clink of glass against stone alerted Emiline that she was not alone in her sanctuary. She froze, eyes darting toward the sound, where a tall figure reclined in the deepest shadows of the rooftop garden. A man sat with his back against the stone balustrade, long legs stretched before him, one hand loosely gripping what appeared to be a crystal decanter. As clouds shifted above, moonlight illuminated his face, and Emiline felt her breath catch. Even in the dim light, there was no mistaking the sharp, aristocratic features of Alexander Sterling, Duke of Westmoreland, though his current state was a far cry from his usual immaculate public persona. His raven hair fell across his forehead in disarray, his cravat hung untied around his neck, and the faint stubble on his jaw suggested hours of neglect. Most striking was the jagged scar that traced from his right temple to his jaw, usually concealed by careful grooming, but now starkly visible in the moonlight. Known throughout London as the Frost Duke for his cold demeanor and cutting remarks, his sudden appearance transformed her private refuge into a tense battlefield. The Duke straightened at her intrusion, clearly as startled by her presence as she was by his. For a long moment, they stared at each other in mutual shock, the distant music from the ballroom floating between them like an echo from another world. Emiline noted the half-empty decanter beside him, the crystal glass balanced precariously on the stone, and the unmistakable scent of expensive whiskey hanging in the air. His eyes narrowed as they traveled from her face to her ruined gown, taking in the crimson stain with an unreadable expression. Humiliation washed over Emiline anew, her sanctuary violated, and her disgrace now witnessed by one of the most powerful men in England. "Have you come to escape society's tedium as well, or merely to witness my disgrace from a new angle?" she asked, her voice carrying more bitterness than she had intended. the evening's accumulated hurts sharpening her usually measured words. The Duke tilted his head slightly, regarding her with unexpected intensity, his eyes the color of storm clouds before rain. Emiline fought the urge to retreat, standing her ground despite the impropriety of their situation. She was already ruined socially after Beatrice's machinations. What further damage could come from this chance encounter with the notorious Duke, who had clearly been drinking alone since well before her arrival, judging by the level of whiskey remaining in his decanter? The garden seemed to hold its breath around them, the night air suddenly charged with tension and possibility. The moonlight cast dramatic shadows across his aristocratic features, softening the harsh lines of his scar, but highlighting the haunted quality in his eyes. This was the man whispered about in drawing rooms across London, the decorated war hero who had returned from the Crimean conflict, changed in ways that went beyond his visible scars. The Duke who refused every matchmaking attempt and spoke to few outside his small circle of trusted confidants. And now he was watching her with an expression that shifted from annoyance to something more complex, something that might have been recognition of a kindred spirit. The silence stretched between them, taut as a bowstring, until the Duke unexpectedly reached for his discarded evening coat lying beside him on the stone bench. "Your gown may be beyond salvation, but you must be cold," he said, his voice deep and rougher than its usual cultured tones heard in Parliament chambers. Without waiting for her response, he rose with surprising grace for a man who had clearly been drinking for hours and approached Emiline, carefully draping the fine wool coat around her shoulders. The warmth of it enveloped her immediately, carrying the scents of sandalwood, whiskey, and something uniquely masculine. She clutched it reflexively, startled by this unexpected kindness from a man known for his frigid demeanor. He gestured toward the bench opposite his own, then retrieved his decanter and offered it to her with an arched brow. "Liquid courage," he remarked, the faintest hint of self-deprecation coloring his words. "I find it dulls the edges of societal expectations rather effectively." Emiline hesitated only briefly before accepting, taking a small sip that burned a fiery path down her throat, warming her from within as his coat warmed her from without. The Duke reclaimed his seat, studying her with those storm-grey eyes that seemed to see far more than she wished to reveal. "I discovered this particular refuge 3 seasons ago," he confided, gesturing vaguely at the rooftop garden around them. "Now I find myself seeking its sanctuary whenever the charade below becomes unbearable. I have spent countless hours on various rooftops across London, mapping the stars rather than engaging in meaningless conversations about the weather or hunting or whichever debutante has the largest dowry this season." The clouds above them parted further, revealing a canvas of stars stretching across the night sky, their light casting a gentle glow over the rooftop garden. "We are fellow fugitives, it seems," he observed, his voice softening with surprising gentleness, the harshness that typically characterized his public persona notably absent. The scar along his jaw caught the silvery light as he tilted his head, regarding her with something akin to recognition. Emiline felt the tension in her shoulders easing slightly as she recognized the truth in his words. Despite his title, his wealth, and his privilege, the Duke of Westmoreland was hiding from the same societal pressures that had driven her to seek solitude, albeit for different reasons. Below them, the music from the ballroom changed tempo, the distant sounds of violins and cellos floating up like fragments of another world, one they had both temporarily abandoned. The night air no longer felt quite so cold, and the sting of humiliation had dulled to a manageable ache as Emiline adjusted his coat more securely around her shoulders and took another small sip from the offered decanter. In this strange moment suspended above London society, she found an unexpected ally in the most unlikely of persons, their shared discomfort with the world below creating a tentative bridge between them. "You seem to be almost curious about my reputation, Lady Emiline," the Duke observed after a period of companionable silence, his fingers absently tracing the jagged line of his scar in the moonlight. Most of society avoids mentioning it directly, preferring instead to whisper behind fans and handkerchiefs. "The Frost Duke, is it not, what they call me now?" Emiline flushed slightly, embarrassed to be caught in her curiosity, but she did not deny it. The sobriquet had indeed followed him through drawing rooms and dinner parties across London since his return from the Crimean conflict 2 years prior. Before the war, Alexander Sterling had been known for his charm and wit, his presence sought at every significant social gathering. The man who returned was almost unrecognizable, not merely for the scar that carved its way across his once unmarred features, but for the coldness that had replaced his former warmth. He took another long drink from his decanter, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the rooftop garden. "Today marks 5 years since the Battle of Inkerman," he said quietly, the admission clearly costing him something in pride. "I was a major then, commanding a company of men, many of whom never returned to English soil. The fog was so thick that morning, one could scarcely see 3 feet ahead. We were outnumbered, surrounded, fighting for our lives in a chaos of smoke and screams. Some scars remain invisible, yet cut deeper than those we can see." Emiline listened in silence, understanding now why he sought solitude and whiskey on this particular evening. Below them, the music from the ballroom shifted to a waltz, the elegant melody drifting upward in cruel contrast to the battlefield horrors he described. The night had deepened around them, stars emerging in greater numbers, as if gathering to witness their unexpected confidence. "I lost 37 men under my command that day," he continued, his voice growing rougher. "Good men with families waiting for their return. I survived with nothing worse than this," he gestured to his face, "but I left something vital on that battlefield nonetheless. The ability to pretend that any of this matters," he waved dismissively toward the sounds of revelry below them. Emiline found herself moved by his candor, seeing beneath his notorious coldness to the wounded man beneath. Society celebrated him as a hero while simultaneously fearing his altered temperament, never considering the weight he carried. The scar that marked his face was merely the visible evidence of deeper injuries, wounds to his spirit that whiskey could temporarily numb, but never heal. The gossips who delighted in his cutting remarks and apparent disdain for social niceties had never bothered to consider the origins of his frost. In this moment of unexpected vulnerability, Emiline saw not the fearsome Duke of legend, but simply Alexander, a man haunted by memories and responsibilities too heavy for any single soul to bear alone. The distant call of her name drifted up from below, breaking the fragile connection between them. "Lady Emiline, Lady Emiline Blackwood." Her aunt, Lady Harriet's voice echoed through the corridors beneath them, concern evident in her increasingly frantic tone. Emiline rose hastily, suddenly aware of how much time had passed and the impropriety of her situation. To be discovered alone with the Duke, regardless of the innocence of their conversation, would complete her social ruin. The Duke seemed to assess the situation with remarkable clarity, despite the whiskey he had consumed, rising to his feet with fluid grace and setting aside his decanter. "We must return you to your aunt before your absence creates more gossip than that unfortunate wine stain," he said, his voice regaining some of its customary authority. He straightened his disheveled appearance with practiced efficiency, retying his cravat and smoothing back his dark hair. Emiline reluctantly removed his evening coat from her shoulders, immediately feeling the chill of the night air as she handed it back to him. The Duke shook his head, draping it around her once more. "Keep it for now. The evening has grown cold, and we can explain it as an act of chivalry when you grew faint from the shock of your gown being ruined. Society thrives on scandal, Lady Emiline. Let us not give them more fodder tonight." He guided her toward the servants' staircase, with a gentle hand at her elbow, his movements betraying a protective instinct that seemed at odds with his reputation for coldness. As they descended the narrow steps, the contrast between the intimate sanctuary of the rooftop and the reality awaiting them below grew more pronounced with each step. The soft moonlight gave way to the harsh illumination of oil lamps lining the corridor, and the peaceful silence was increasingly broken by the sounds of music and laughter. When they reached the bottom of the staircase, the Duke paused, listening to determine their position relative to the searching party. Lady Harriet could be heard questioning a footman nearby, her voice tight with worry. "Wait here a moment," the Duke instructed before stepping into the corridor alone. Emmeline heard him addressing her aunt, explaining that he had found Lady Emiline seeking fresh air after her unfortunate accident, and had offered his coat when he noticed her distress. His tone carried just the right blend of aristocratic authority and gentlemanly concern to deflect any potential impropriety. When he returned to guide Emmeline into the brightly lit corridor, she was struck by how seamlessly he had constructed a narrative to protect her reputation. Lady Harriet hurried toward her niece, relief evident in her expression, too concerned with Emmeline's welfare to question the Duke's unexpected involvement. As they made their way back toward the main hall, Emmeline was acutely aware of the stark difference between the intimate conversation they had shared under the stars and the rigid formality now reasserting itself with each step toward society. Yet something had irrevocably changed, a connection forged in that rooftop sanctuary that neither the bright lights nor the watching eyes of the Tun could completely erase. Morning light filtered through the modest curtains of the Blackwood townhouse on Harley Street, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and highlighting the subtle signs of genteel poverty that Emmeline and her aunt had worked so diligently to disguise. The wallpaper, once fashionable, now showed faint water stains in the corners, while the furniture, though of good quality, bore the polished patina of items too frequently repaired rather than replaced. Seated at the small breakfast table, Emmeline silently endured her aunt's recounting of the previous evening's disaster, each detail more mortifying than the last. By now, the tale of the wine-stained gown would have spread to every fashionable breakfast table in Mayfair, embellished with each retelling. Lady Harriet had already received 3 notes from so-called friends expressing sympathy while thinly disguising their delight in the latest on diet involving the scandalous Blackwood family. What would become of their hopes for a respectable match now? Lady Harriet lamented, stirring her tea with uncharacteristic force. The entire season ruined before it properly began. Emmeline could not bring herself to feel the appropriate level of distress, her thoughts repeatedly returning to the rooftop garden and the unexpected connection she had formed with the Duke of Westmoreland. She had returned his evening coat before departing the ball, their farewell formal and proper, with no indication that their confidences shared under starlight would extend beyond that single evening. The sharp knock at the door interrupted Lady Harriet's litany of social catastrophes, followed by their aging butler entering with a silver salver bearing a sealed note. The heavy cream parchment bore the Westmoreland crest impressed in dark blue wax, causing both women to stare in momentary disbelief. With trembling fingers, Emmeline broke the seal and unfolded the missive, recognizing the bold, slashing handwriting from government documents she had seen published in newspapers. The Duke of Westmoreland presents his compliments to Lady Emiline Blackwood and extends an invitation to view his private library collection tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock. The note read, "Miss Blackwood's literary interests might be satisfied by my collection. Accompaniment required, of course." Lady Harriet nearly dropped her teacup, her expression transforming from resignation to cautious hope. "The Duke of Westmoreland, inviting you to his private residence," she whispered, as if speaking too loudly might cause the note to vanish. This was unprecedented. The Frost Duke, who attended social functions only when absolutely required by duty, who had rebuffed the advances of countesses and heiresses alike, was extending a personal invitation to the very woman society was currently ridiculing. Emiline reread the brief message, noting the specific mention of literary interests. Had he somehow discerned her secret passion for writing during their rooftop conversation, perhaps noticing her ink-stained fingers in the moonlight? Whatever his motivation, this invitation represented something precious amid the wreckage of her social prospects, a hand extended when all others had been withdrawn. The same morning light that had so cruelly exposed their reduced circumstances now seemed to cast a more hopeful glow as Emiline carefully refolded the note, her heart beating a swift tattoo against her ribs. Promptly at 3 o'clock the following afternoon, Emiline and Lady Harriet arrived at the imposing Westmoreland house on Grosvenor Square, its Portland stone facade gleaming in the autumn sunlight. A liveried footman escorted them through a marble foyer and along a corridor lined with ancestral portraits, each sterling generation watching their progress with painted eyes that seemed to follow their movement. The Duke's butler announced them at the threshold of what proved to be the most magnificent private library Emiline had ever beheld. Towering bookshelves stretched from floor to ceiling, accessible by a system of rolling ladders and elevated walkways that created the impression of a literary cathedral. Emiline could not suppress a soft gasp of wonder as she took in the collection, organized not by appearance as in many aristocratic homes, but clearly by subject and use, with well-worn volumes intermingled with pristine first editions. The Duke himself stood before a crackling fire, the warm glow softening his austere features and illuminating his scar in a way that made it seem less a flaw than a distinctive mark of character. He greeted them with formal courtesy, but Emiline detected a warmth in his grey eyes that had been absent in their previous encounters in society. After the requisite pleasantries, he guided them through the collection, pointing out rare volumes and ancient manuscripts with the enthusiasm of a true scholar rather than a mere collector. Lady Harriet, who held little interest in literary pursuits, was diplomatically directed to a comfortable chair near the fire where refreshments awaited, leaving Emiline and the Duke to explore the shelves with appropriate distance but increasing animation. When he led her to a secluded reading alcove with comfortable leather chairs nestled between twin windows overlooking his private gardens, Emiline found herself confessing her own literary aspirations. To her astonishment, the Duke requested to see her work, his expression revealing genuine interest rather than polite indulgence. With trembling fingers, she withdrew a small journal from her reticule, a volume she had brought on impulse, hardly daring to hope for such an opportunity. The Duke accepted it with unexpected reverence, his fingers careful not to damage the well-worn binding as he began to read her account of a soldier's last letter home before battle. His expression shifted from curiosity to genuine surprise as he progressed through her prose, the minutes stretching in silence broken only by the occasional turning of a page and the soft pop of burning logs in the fireplace. "You write about war with remarkable insight for someone who has never witnessed it," he finally observed, looking up to study her face with new appreciation. His tone held no condescension, only a genuine curiosity that emboldened Emiline to explain her research, her interviews with returned soldiers, and her determination to understand experiences beyond her own limited sphere. As afternoon light streamed through leaded windows, casting golden patterns across ancient volumes and illuminating dust motes that danced between them like fairy lights, Emiline realized that for perhaps the first time in her life, she was being seen not as a problematic connection or damaged goods on the marriage market, but as a mind worthy of engagement and respect. As Lady Harriet dozed in her chair beside the fire, lulled by warmth and tea, Emiline and the Duke continued their literary discussions in the secluded reading alcove, their voices gradually lowering to intimate murmurs that would not disturb her aunt. Outside the leaded glass windows, clouds had gathered, darkening the afternoon sky and eventually releasing a gentle autumn rain that pattered against the panes, further isolating their sanctuary from the outside world. The Duke ran his finger along the edge of her journal, his expression troubled yet somehow lighter, as if preparing to set down a burden carried too long. "The battle I spoke of at Inkerman," he began, his voice barely audible above the rain. "There was more I did not tell you on the rooftop." He spoke of a reconnaissance mission the night before, of intelligence reports indicating Russian forces gathering in the fog-shrouded valley, reports he had deemed exaggerated and insufficient to postpone their planned advance. When dawn broke and the attack came, his men were caught unprepared, surrounded in the thick fog, fighting blindly against an enemy they could barely see. It was my arrogance, my certainty in my own judgment that led them to their deaths, he confessed, his fingers unconsciously tracing the scar on his face, a permanent reminder of his perceived failure. The rain intensified beyond the windows, running in rivulets down the glass like tears neither of them would allow themselves to shed. Emiline listened without judgment, recognizing in his story echoes of her own family tragedy. When he finished, she found herself speaking of her father, not the sanitized version presented to society, but the truth she had never shared beyond family walls. The Viscount Blackwood had not merely made unfortunate investments, as the official story claimed, but had fallen prey to a gambling addiction that consumed him, losing first their fortune, then their ancestral home, and finally his will to live. She described finding his body in his study, the note that begged forgiveness but offered no explanation she could understand at 15. "We are both haunted by ghosts we cannot control," she said softly, bridging their experiences with quiet understanding. The Duke reached across the small table between them, his hand covering hers in a gesture that would have been scandalously improper in any other context. In that moment, surrounded by ancient tomes that had witnessed centuries of human triumphs and sorrows, something shifted between them, a recognition that went beyond mere sympathy to true understanding. Neither spoke for several minutes, the silence broken only by the rhythmic drumming of rain and occasional crackle from the fireplace. When Alexander finally withdrew his hand, his expression had transformed. The frost that typically guarded his features thawed by shared vulnerability. Lady Harriet stirred in her chair across the room. But the connection forged in those quiet moments remained, an invisible thread binding two souls who had finally found someone who could see beyond their carefully constructed facades to the wounded hearts beneath. The week following their library encounter saw a flurry of activity in London society, as news of the Duke's apparent interest in Lady Emiline Blackwood spread through drawing rooms and tea tables with remarkable speed. Lady Beatrice Winfield, determined to maintain her position as the season's most sought-after debutante, began carefully cultivating rumors regarding Emiline's true intentions. How convenient that the impoverished daughter of a disgraced Viscount should suddenly capture the attention of one of England's wealthiest peers, she commented loudly at Lady Pembroke's musical evening, her voice pitched to carry to nearby listeners. One must admire such determined fortune-hunting, particularly after such a disastrous debut. The poison spread efficiently through the ton, whispers of opportunism and calculated pursuit, following Emiline whenever she appeared in public. Meanwhile, the Duke found himself cornered in his own home by his cousin, Lady Montgomery, a sharp-witted widow who had managed his household since his parents' deaths. Victoria Montgomery had watched Alexander grow from solemn boy to wounded man, her loyalty fierce and protective. "Alexander, you must exercise caution with this Blackwood girl," she advised as they sat in his study, reviewing household accounts. "Her family is notorious for financial ruin, and such desperate circumstances often inspire desperate measures." Her warning might have carried more weight had Alexander not witnessed the genuine expression in Emiline's amber eyes when she spoke of her father's tragedy. "I've made inquiries," Victoria continued, setting aside her ledger. "The Blackwoods are barely maintaining appearances, living on credit and the charity of distant relations. Marriage to you would solve all their problems rather neatly." The Duke remained silent, his expression unreadable, as his cousin studied him with increasing concern. "I've seen how she looks at you, Alexander," Lady Montgomery finally said, her voice softening. "Not with calculation, but with something far more dangerous, understanding." The annual Kensington Garden Party the following afternoon provided the perfect battleground for society to implement its intervention. Despite the Duke's unprecedented gesture of personally escorting Emiline and her aunt through the elaborate floral displays, they found themselves repeatedly separated by strategic interruptions. Dowagers with eligible granddaughters required the Duke's immediate opinion on trivial matters, while Emiline was cornered by Lady Beatrice and her circle, their barbed comments thinly disguised as concern. Even Lady Harriet, seduced by the sudden attention of countesses who had previously ignored her existence, began to waver in her support, wondering aloud whether they were reaching above their station. Throughout the afternoon, Emiline caught glimpses of Alexander across manicured lawns, his expression increasingly thunderous as he attempted to navigate back to her side, only to be intercepted yet again by determined matchmakers and concerned friends. Society had recognized the threat to its established order and mobilized with ruthless efficiency to eliminate it, drawing battle lines around two people who had dared to forge a connection that transcended the rigid boundaries of class and circumstance. The evening of the Duke's small dinner party arrived with surprising swiftness, Emiline finding herself once again a sinner, ascending the grand staircase of Westmoreland House, though this time as an invited guest rather than a social obligation. Lady Harriet accompanied her, visibly torn between concern over the persistent rumours and delight at their continued association with such elevated company. The guest list proved remarkably selective, merely 8 carefully chosen individuals, including several literary figures whose work Emiline had long admired, suggesting that Alexander had considered her interests rather than social connections when extending the invitation. Throughout the meal, served in a smaller dining room rather than the formal banquet hall, Emiline noted subtle changes in the Duke's demeanour. His customary frost thawed to reveal glimpses of the man she had encountered on the rooftop and in his library. The conversation flowed freely among art, literature, and philosophy, with Alexander frequently drawing Emiline into discussions where her insights might shine, his grey eyes warming whenever she spoke. As the evening progressed and guests began to depart, he approached her with uncharacteristic hesitation, his voice lowered for her ears alone. "There is something I wish to show you, if you would permit it. Your aunt is welcome to accompany us, of course." Lady Harriet, exhausted from maintaining appearances and lulled by excellent wine, graciously declined, preferring to rest in the drawing-room while chaperoned by Lady Montgomery, whose shrewd eyes followed them as Alexander guided Emiline toward the servants' staircase they had descended together weeks earlier. This time, however, they climbed upward, following the familiar path to the rooftop garden where their unlikely connection had first formed. As Alexander opened the door to the rooftop, Emiline could not suppress a soft gasp of wonder. The once austere garden had been transformed into an enchanted sanctuary, with lanterns hanging from wrought iron stands casting golden light across the stone pathways. Comfortable chairs had been arranged near a small table laden with books, while potted plants created intimate alcoves throughout the space. The night air carried the scent of jasmine and roses, and woolen blankets awaited on each seat to ward off the autumn chill. "I find I can breathe only in two places now," Alexander confessed, as they moved to the stone balustrade, overlooking the London skyline, my library and this rooftop. "Both are better when shared with you." The admission, spoken without his usual guard, revealed more than mere appreciation for her company. Emiline felt something shift between them as they stood side by side beneath the vast canopy of stars, the twinkling lights of London spreading before them like a reflection of the night sky. Here, beyond the reach of society and its judgments, Alexander seemed to shed the weight of his title and reputation, becoming simply a man standing beside a woman who understood the shadows he carried. He had created this sanctuary not merely for himself, but for them both, a place where neither would be defined by the expectations and limitations imposed by others. When his hand found hers atop the stone balustrade, the contact felt as natural as breathing, a silent acknowledgement of the connection that had grown between them despite every effort of society to prevent it. The Hartington ballroom, scene of Emiline's initial humiliation, glowed with even greater splendor for the annual winter ball, the very event that traditionally marked the pinnacle of the London season. 3 weeks had passed since the Rooftop sanctuary, during which Alexander and Emiline had cultivated their connection through carriage rides, gallery visits, and literary discussions that had set tongues wagging throughout fashionable society. Tonight they had arrived separately, yet Alexander had sought her out immediately upon her entrance, claiming her hand for the first waltz with a public decisiveness that sent ripples of speculation through the assembled guests. They had just completed their dance, Alexander guiding Emiline toward where Lady Harriet sat with newfound social connections, when Lady Beatrice intercepted them, her golden curls arranged in elaborate ringlets beneath a diamond tiara, her smile sharp as a newly honed blade. She curtsied with exaggerated deference, her voice pitched to carry across the nearby gathering. "How fortunate for you, Lady Emiline, that the Duke of Westmoreland remains unaware of the true circumstances of your father's disgrace." The ballroom seemed to still around them as Lady Beatrice continued, her words cutting through the ambient music and conversation like shards of glass. "Your father did not merely suffer financial misfortune, Your Grace." She addressed Alexander directly, ignoring Emiline's suddenly pale face. "He took his own life after gambling away his family fortune, leaving nothing but debts and disgrace. One might almost admire Lady Emiline's resourcefulness in securing your interest so swiftly after her disastrous debut." Colour drained from Emiline's face as the carefully guarded family secret was exposed in the most public manner possible. Around them, guests pretended not to listen, while hanging on every word, the scandal too delicious to ignore. Alexander stood frozen beside her, his expression unreadable as Lady Beatrice's accusations hung in the air between them. "Is it true?" he asked finally, his voice low but clear in the charged silence. "Did you know who I was that night on the rooftop?" Doubt clouded his grey eyes, the warmth she had grown accustomed to suddenly obscured by the frost of suspicion. The question struck Emiline like a physical blow, revealing that despite their growing closeness, Alexander remained vulnerable to the fear of being valued only for his title and fortune. In that moment of hesitation, she saw years of cynicism and mistrust battling against the connection they had formed. Around them, society watched with bated breath, eager to witness the Frost Duke return in full force to see the presumptuous fortune hunter put firmly in her place. Lady Beatrice smiled in triumph. secure in the knowledge that she had successfully severed the inexplicable bond between the season's most eligible bachelor and the disgraced Viscount's daughter. The orchestra began another waltz, the music jarring against the tense tableau at the edge of the dance floor, as Emiline faced the most critical moment of her young life, her heart suspended between shattered trust and desperate hope. Dawn had barely broken when Emiline fled London, leaving only a brief note for her aunt explaining that she could not bear to face further humiliation. The hired coach carried her through rain-soaked countryside to Blackwood Manor, the once proud family seat now standing empty save for a caretaker and his wife, who maintained what little remained after the creditors had taken their due. Stepping into the grand entrance hall, its chandelier now shrouded in dust covers, its floors bare of the Persian carpets she remembered from childhood, Emiline felt a strange kinship with the decaying structure, both of them shadows of former glory, yet still standing, despite all attempts to destroy them. While she wandered through empty rooms where furniture impressions marked the floors like ghosts, Alexander paced his London study, Lady Beatrice's accusations echoing relentlessly in his mind. Her absence had been discovered within hours, but his inquiries had met only Lady Harriet's tearful confusion and closed doors across London, as society eagerly anticipated his public rejection of the scandalous connection. 3 days of fruitless searching led him to his cousin's private chambers, where Victoria Montgomery found him staring into the fire, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand. "I've been a fool, Victoria," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. "I allowed doubt to creep in despite everything we had shared, despite knowing in my heart that her interest was never in my title or fortune. She told me about her father's suicide weeks ago, in confidence, in trust, and still I hesitated when confronted publicly. The fear of being used, of opening myself to potential betrayal, overcame what I knew to be true." Lady Montgomery studied her cousin with unexpected gentleness, recognizing the internal battle he had waged since returning from war. "I have faced enemy fire with less terror than the thought of loving someone again," he admitted, finally giving voice to the truth he had been avoiding. "Loving means vulnerability, the possibility of loss, of pain beyond endurance. Yet the alternative, never permitting anyone past my defenses, seems suddenly unbearable." At Blackwood Manor, Emiline stood at her father's study window, watching storm clouds gather over untended gardens where she had once played as a child before scandal and ruin had reshaped their lives. The pain of Alexander's doubt cut deeper than Lady Beatrice's malice, yet she could not bring herself to condemn him for it. They were both products of their wounds, she carrying the shame of her father's actions, he the burden of his perceived military failure, each afraid to trust completely, lest that trust prove misplaced. What neither realized, as evening shadows lengthened across London streets and country fields alike, was that their separate retreats had led them to the same conclusion, that some connections were worth the risk of pain, some hearts worth fighting for despite the fears that threatened to overwhelm them. The morning mist clung to the grounds of Blackwood Manor as Alexander arrived, his carriage wheels crunching on the neglected gravel drive after a night journey that had left him weary but determined. He had found her at last, not through his extensive inquiries in London, but through understanding her heart, realizing she would seek refuge in the one place that held her truest memories, painful though they might be. The butler had barely opened the door when Alexander asked about the rooftop, somehow knowing she would be drawn to heights just as he always had been in times of turmoil. Following the aging servant's directions, he climbed narrow servant stairs until he emerged onto the flat section of roof where Emiline stood, silhouetted against the lightening sky, her chestnut curls loose around her shoulders, her simple morning dress fluttering in the gentle breeze. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, her amber eyes widening with surprise, then clouding with remembered hurt as she gripped the stone balustrade behind her. Alexander approached slowly, his heart pounding with more fear than he had ever felt on any battlefield, the weight of his mistake heavy between them. The first golden rays of dawn broke over the distant hills as he finally stood before her, close enough to see the traces of tears on her cheeks, yet maintaining a respectful distance that she might choose to bridge or maintain. Without preamble or pride, he spoke of his journey to find her, of the realization that had struck him with the force of revelation as he searched, that in questioning her intentions he had betrayed not only her trust, but his own heart. "You found me drinking alone in darkness that first night, but it is you who has been my light," he told her, his voice rough with emotion too long suppressed. "The question is not whether I can trust you, but whether I am worthy of you, whether a man so broken by war and so frozen by fear deserves the warmth you have brought into his life." Emiline listened silently, her expression gradually softening as Alexander laid bare his soul, confessing how her understanding had begun to heal wounds he had thought permanent, how her courage in facing society's cruelty had shown him the hollowness of his own isolation. The rising sun now illuminated them both, casting long shadows across the weathered stones of the roof garden while burnishing their features with golden light, a physical manifestation of the clarity dawning between them. When he finally fell silent, Emiline stepped forward, closing the distance he had carefully maintained, her hand reaching up to trace the scar on his face with gentle fingers that held no revulsion, only acceptance. As birds began their morning chorus in the trees below, two souls who had found each other first in darkness now stood together in the light, their fears acknowledged but no longer controlling. Their trust rebuilt on stronger foundations than before, ready to face whatever judgment society might render with the certainty that some connections transcended the petty constraints of convention and circumstance. London, 1848, 1 year to the night after Lady Beatrice's ill-fated confrontation at the Hartington Winter Ball. The rooftop garden of Westmoreland House glowed with the light of 100 lanterns, their golden illumination transforming the space into an enchanted realm suspended above the busy streets of Mayfair. Where once Alexander had sought solitude and oblivion through whiskey, now laughter and animated conversation filled the air as 24 of London's finest literary minds gathered to celebrate the publication of E.B. Sterling's newest work, a collection of war stories that had critics comparing the mysterious author to established masters. Only those gathered on the rooftop knew that E.B. Sterling was in fact the Duchess of Westmoreland, whose ink-stained fingers now bore not only the evidence of her passion for writing, but also the heavy gold band of her marriage. Emiline moved among their guests with easy grace, her amber eyes bright with happiness as she engaged in debates about literature and philosophy, no longer the shunned debutante, but a respected intellectual in her own right. The transformation of the rooftop mirrored the transformation in both their lives, with comfortable seating arranged in conversational groups, bookshelves built into alcoves protected from the elements, and flowering vines climbing trellises that created intimate spaces throughout the garden. Society had eventually accepted their unconventional union, particularly after the Duke's impassioned defense of his wife, before the House of Lords had secured passage of a bill expanding educational opportunities for women of all classes, inspired by Emiline's own struggles to pursue her literary interests. Where once the Frost Duke had stood alone against the world, Alexander now found purpose in partnership, the wounds of war gradually healing through shared purpose and understanding. As the evening drew to a close and their guests began to depart, Alexander guided Emiline to their favorite spot along the balustrade where they had first connected in vulnerability and truth, Above them, stars sparkled in the clear night sky, the same eternal witnesses that had observed their initial encounter, yet now shining on two people fundamentally changed by love. Alexander traced the line of Emiline's cheek with gentle fingers, his grey eyes warm with an emotion that would have been unimaginable to the solitary man who had sought refuge in whiskey and isolation a year before. "We found each other in the shadows, my love, but we will live in the light," he told her, his voice carrying the absolute certainty that had replaced his former doubts. Emiline leaned into his embrace, no longer afraid of judgment or rejection, secure in the knowledge that their connection had been forged in understanding rather than convenience or advantage. Together they had created something neither could have imagined alone, a sanctuary not just of stone and wood, but of hearts finally brave enough to trust despite past wounds, to love despite fear, and to build a future unconstrained by the narrow expectations of the world below.